Hello and welcome to chapter 13 of our biopsychology course. And it doesn't really get more biopsychology than hormones and sex, as anybody who's gone through puberty is well aware of the biological changes and the psychological changes that come along with that awkward stage of development. So let's get into it. Earlier in the semester, we briefly introduced sex differentiation from a genetic standpoint, where we talked about the 23rd pair of chromosomes, which come in XX or XY typically, and those then can lead to sex-linked traits. Now, in general, X and Y chromosomes on the 23rd pair are going to yield biological factors, particularly hormone differences that we're going to focus a lot on in this chapter, that are going to develop and activate sexual dimorphisms. Now, sexual dimorphism is a term, a technical term, essentially just means that there's two classes of male and female that mostly account for individuals within a species. And then there's variation within and across those. So if we look at peacocks, for example, this is a sexual dimorphism for them, where the male peacock develops this beautiful plumage, and the female peahen doesn't. Right, so it's a sexual difference in biological characteristics that develops primarily, at least, based on the sex chromosomes on X and Y. So this is sort of genetic differences that we've introduced way back in chapter 2. In this chapter, we're going to go beyond these differences and talk about how those differences develop based on the hormones that are differentiated in those systems, and we'll talk about psychological differences in terms of behavior. So overall, first we're going to cover the neuroendocrine system, which deals with hormones. We'll do that in this video. In the next video, we'll talk about how hormones influence sexual development specifically. And then finally, we'll talk about sexual behavior, sexual orientation, and gender identity as more psychological traits that are related to, but not necessarily caused directly by these differences. So the neuroendocrine system in general is a big topic about how your nervous system interacts with your endocrine system, or how your brain interacts with your hormones, right? And this is going to be critical to talking about sex differences, and then ultimately to gender and sexuality differences as well. There's going to be some interactions there. So let's talk generally about how your hormone system works, how that interacts with your nervous system. So you're probably aware that our body includes a variety of glands. So glands are part of your endocrine system. These glands release chemicals into the body, or release them into the surroundings. If your glands release things out of your body, they're called exocrine glands, like exiting your body. So tear ducts, sweat glands, tear glands, sweat glands, salivary glands, mammary glands. Those are all glands that are release things out into the world. And then it's endocrine glands that we're focusing on for hormones. So these are glands that don't release things out into the world. They release things into your body through your circulatory system. There's a variety of glands on this figure: the pineal, hypothalamus, the pituitary gland, the thyroid, parathyroid, thymus, adrenal, pancreas, ovary, and testes. Right. So you may be aware of quite a few of these. They have release hormones that motivate different behaviors. Particularly for this chapter, we're going to focus on the last two, the ovary and the testes, which fall into a category called the gonads. These are most clearly sexually dimorphic. Now, there are sex differences in other glands, particularly the adrenal gland, for example, but it's the ovary and testes that are quite obviously different and develop differently, and that's going to have some consequences for our hormone release. Hormones in general come in three classes. There are simple ones that are just derived from amino acids. So epinephrine and melatonin are some of these. You might be aware of melatonin as being related to sleep. We'll cover that in a later chapter. You may know of epinephrine as adrenaline, is another term for it. There's more complicated hormones like growth hormone, oxytocin, and insulin that you might be aware insulin regulates sugar use, and oxytocin is involved in bonding, so you may be aware of some of these. And then finally, there's a class of hormones called steroids. Now, these classes are based on their chemical similarity, and all the steroids are very similar to each other in terms of their chemical makeup. The steroids are oftentimes thought of as sex-related hormones or sex hormones. This includes androgens like testosterone, it includes estrogens, and it includes progestins. All these are sex steroids. They tend to be sexually dimorphic, where depending on the gonads that you develop with, you'll release different levels of androgens, estrogens, and progestins. Now, we want to be clear here that androgens are more prominent in males and estrogens are more prominent in females, but both are present and important in both sexes. So males have testosterone, they also have estradiol, right? And vice versa for females. One particularly important gland in your neuroendocrine system is the pituitary gland, which is highlighted here on this page. The pituitary gland kind of is this stalk that runs directly off of your brain and is connected to your brain, but it's not technically part of your brain itself. Pituitary gland sits right here and is connected to the hypothalamus. You see the hypothalamus here and the thalamus here, right? The pituitary gland is so important because it and is sometimes referred to as the master gland because it releases what are known as tropic hormones. Tropic hormones regulate other hormones. Okay? So, for example, gonadotropins control the gonads, and gonadotropins are tropic hormones that are released by the pituitary gland. Specifically, these tropic hormones are released from the anterior pituitary, so toward the front of your skull. Right? The posterior pituitary releases hormones all by itself. So like oxytocin and vasopressin get released by the posterior pituitary by itself. It's the anterior pituitary its main role is going to be controlling other glands throughout your body. The pituitary gland, and in particular the anterior pituitary, is directly connected to and controlled by the hypothalamus. So this is where our connection is going to be between our brain and the hypothalamus and our endocrine system, starting at the pituitary gland. So let's think about how this might work for sex differences in terms of hormone release. The anterior pituitary is going to connect or is going to send signals, tropic hormones, right, that are going to activate the gonadal hormones. In females, the gonadal hormones are cyclic, right? They follow about a 28-day cycle. Okay, many females out there will be able to relate to this cyclic release of different hormones throughout the month. Male gonadal hormones are relatively steady across the month. They may vary from time to time. Okay. This cycle, or lack of cycle, is controlled not by the gonads themselves, not by the ovaries or the testes, but by the pituitary gland. But in fact, it's not the pituitary gland that starts the action. In fact, transplanting the pituitary gland from a female to a male doesn't transfer this cycle. So in rats, the cycle is a lot faster. It's maybe like 4 days, but they also have cycles. If you transplant a female pituitary gland to a male rat, they don't get the cyclical release. If you transfer from one female rat to another female rat who are on different cycles, they don't change their cycles. And so this master gland seems to have its own master. That's the one that's actually responsible for the different activity, and that's the hypothalamus. So it's the hypothalamus, our brain, that's going to control the anterior pituitary. The anterior pituitary is going to send tropic hormones to the gonadal hormones. So ultimately, our release of testosterone, our release of estradiol and progestin that changes throughout the month for genetic females um, or people with ovaries. Those going to be responsible um, through the anterior pituitary, but beginning with the hypothalamus. So your brain is controlling those things. This whole system is regulated throughout the process. So ultimately, we're going to have release of um, hormones, sex steroids, from our gonads, right? Releasing estrogens, androgens, progestins. Those are going to go out into our body and affect us. They're going to, make some of us grow body hair and some of us not grow body hair. They're going to make some of us grow bigger breast tissue, right? That's regulated by the anterior pituitary, which runs into circulation. The anterior pituitary is regulated by the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is regulated by the rest of the brain. And then there's feedback along the way. There's neural signals, hormonal signals, and non-hormonal signals from the body all throughout the process. Okay, so sometimes we think about this our hormones being like a dumb system, right? But they're ultimately going to be regulated by and connected to our brains. So if our hormone system is dumb, then it's because our brain is dumb. But there's a lot of regulation process to keep this steady or cyclical and to change throughout our lifetime. So we'll get different release of sex steroids at different times of our life. And this is going to be regulated as we go.